ALEATORY podcast.
I want you to just try to imagine a scenario for a second. You're young, maybe in your late teens, right? Living in the early part of the 20th century.
Okay, yeah. Setting the scene.
Right, and you are handed this substance, and it's just unlike anything you have ever seen in your entire life. I mean, it literally glows.
Wow.
But not, not with a reflected light. It glows with its own, like, eternal luminescence. This pale, kind of ethereal green light that just seems to totally defy the laws of nature.
Almost like magic, honestly.
Exactly. And society, I mean, the greatest scientific minds of your generation, the newspapers, the doctors, they all tell you that this glowing stuff is an absolute miracle.
Right. The authorities are fully backing it.
Yeah, they tell you it cures literally everything, like arthritis, gout, aging, fatigue. They say it's the very essence of human vitality. And you're paid really handsomely to work with it. You're told it's going to make you beautiful.
So you're the envy of all your friends, basically.
Oh, absolutely. It's a gift from the modern world. So, of course, you welcome it into your life. You literally welcome it into your body.
I mean, why wouldn't you? Right.
Exactly. But at what point, I really have to ask you, at what exact moment do you finally realize that the light you've been swallowing is actually burning you from the inside out? Like, when do you realize the miracle is actually occurs?
Oh, man. It's such a terrifying premise because it preys on our most fundamental vulnerability, our absolute blind trust in the promise of progress.
Yeah, that blind trust is so dangerous.
It is. But the craziest part is this isn't some hypothetical thought experiment. This is not a fiction story. This was the waking nightmare for hundreds of actual American women.
It's just devastating.
We so desperately want to believe that the shiny new discovery is the answer to all of our problems, so we just invite the Trojan horse right inside the city gates because it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And because the authorities tell us it's a gift.
Welcome to the episode. Together we turn knowledge into real results. Today, we have a mission that really requires us to look back into one of the darkest, just most harrowing corners of American industrial history.
You really do. We're looking at a massive stack of source material today.
Yeah, we have historical documents, scientific pathology reports, legal records, and all these journalistic accounts from the 1920s and 30s. And our goal here is to completely unpack the world-changing saga of the Radium Girls.
These were the young women whose, frankly, tragic exploitation literally rewrote American labor laws.
Right, and established the very foundations of modern radiation science. We're going to treat every single historical document we have in front of us as a vital clue in this massive, catastrophic puzzle.
And it's a puzzle where the pieces are incredibly deceptive. We're going to trace this whole journey from a Nobel Prize-winning scientific triumph
to an absolute biological nightmare.
Exactly. We'll get into the precise chemical and physical mechanisms of the poisoning, the incredibly calculated corporate cover-ups, the forged medical reports, and the eventual just agonizing crusade for justice.
Because the implications of what happened to these women, they literally echo in every single workplace safety regulation we take for granted today.
They really do. So where do we start with the timeline?
Well, the story really has to start with the luminous miracle itself, right?
Yeah.
December 1898, Marie and Pierre Curie discovered the 88th element on the periodic table, radium.
Radium, a heavy alkaline earth metal.
Yeah, and it is just intensely radioactive. It has a half-life of 1,602 years. Like, I really want you to just sit with that specific number for a second, 1,602 years.
It's a span of time that is almost incomprehensible on a human scale, right?
Totally incomprehensible.
I mean, it means that if you possess just a single gram of radium today, in the year 3500, half of that gram will still be sitting there, actively emitting immense amounts of radiation into whatever environment it's in.
It represents a literal eternal fire.
Yeah. And the moment the Curies discover this, the early 20th century world absolutely loses its collective mind. I mean, this massive radium craze just sweeps across the globe.
Because early medical experiments showed it could actually shrink tumors, right? So the public leaps to the wildest possible conclusion.
Right. The logic was if it destroys cancer, well, it must be the ultimate panacea, a cure-all for literally every human ailment.
And the market responds to that frenzy with staggering valuations. I mean, by 1915, the price of a single gram of radium hits $84,500.
Wow. $84,000 for 1 gram.
Yeah.
In 1915 money.
Exactly. And that kind of valuation creates an environment that's just ripe for absolute recklessness.
Oh, for sure. When an element is perceived as basically a fountain of youth and priced that astronomically, the consumer applications become totally unhinged from any actual scientific reality.
The historical records show this flood of bizarre and terrifying products hitting the consumer market. Like people were buying Vita Radium suppositories.
Oh, God. Suppositories?
Yes, blindly trusting the marketing that they would somehow restore their vitality. You also had X-radium cooking utensils, so you could literally irradiate your family's dinner while you cooked it.
That is just horrifying to think about.
Right. There were radium-laced cosmetics, hair creams, and even toothpaste meant to brighten your smile.
Yeah.
But perhaps the most infamous manifestation of this entire craze was a product called Radiator.
Ah, Radiator, which was essentially just water laced with highly radioactive isotopes of radium.
Just radioactive water.
Yeah, and it was marketed to the public as a literal cure for the living dead. And, you really have to understand the psychology here to get why people did this.
Well, let's play the skeptic for a second.
You
Like,
know,
why were people so eager to blindly ingest a highly radioactive alkaline earth metal?
Right, it wasn't just pure ignorance, actually. It was a fundamental, tragic misunderstanding of biological chemistry.
Which brings us to the underlying science of the poisoning. The real tragedy of radium isn't just simply that it's radioactive.
No, the true horror is rooted in its specific location on the periodic table of elements. And crucially, how the human body interprets that specific location.
Let's break that down, actually. Let's look really deeply at that chemistry, because it's the engine driving this entire catastrophe.
Okay, so radium sits in group 2 of the periodic table, right? It's an alkaline earth metal. If you look slightly higher up in that exact same group 2 column, you find another alkaline earth metal, calcium.
Calcium, the exact element the human body relies upon to build and maintain its entire skeletal structure.
Precisely. And elements in the same group on the periodic table share the exact same valence electron configuration.
Meaning they have the same number of electrons in their outer shell.
Exactly. Both calcium and radium possess exactly 2 electrons in their outermost orbital shell. And the human body is, a marvel of evolutionary engineering, but it is not a nuclear physicist.
Right, it can't tell the difference.
At a molecular level, it chemically interacts with the world purely based on those outer electrons.
So it literally cannot chemically distinguish between a molecule of calcium and a molecule of radium.
It cannot. It's totally blind to the difference. Imagine the human skeletal system as this massive, continuously fortified castle, right? The body is constantly rebuilding this fortress, constantly scanning the bloodstream for calcium to reinforce the bone walls.
And it eagerly opens the biological gates whenever it senses those 2 valence electrons.
Exactly, making radium the ultimate biological Trojan horse.
Wow. That's a terrifying way to put it.
You ingest radium, it enters your digestive tract, moves right into your bloodstream, and your body looks at those 2 outer valence electrons and says, oh, great, calcium.
And it immediately shuttles it directly to the bone marrow.
Yes. It embeds it right into the skeletal matrix. The radium perfectly disguises itself, slips past every biological defense mechanism you have, and permanently cements itself into the very structural foundation of your body.
And once it's locked in the bone, it just sits there, firing off highly energetic radiation directly into the surrounding tissue, 24 hours a day, for the rest of your life.
It is absolutely chilling to think about. And, you can see the extreme visceral end of this consumer craze in individuals like Eben McBurney Byers.
Oh, yes, Byers.
He was a wealthy playboy who just started religiously drinking Radiator. The records show he consumed approximately 1,400 bottles of this radium water.
Over 1,000 bottles.
Oh, yeah. And his body absorbed so much of this Trojan horse that his jaw completely disintegrated. The radiation simply hollowed out his skeleton from within.
But as terrifying as that consumer craze was, guys drinking it for vitality, the real core of our investigation today is the industrial application, the working class.
Because that's where the scale of this gets truly industrial.
Exactly. Because in 1914, Dr. Sabin Arnold von Sachaki and Dr. George S. Willis founded what would eventually become the United States Radium Corporation, or USRC.
And they kind of realized they were sitting on a gold mine with a very specific, highly lucrative chemical mixture. They created this proprietary paint known as Undark.
Undark. It's a very evocative name.
It really is. It was a precise mixture of radium-226 chloride, a specialized glue, and zinc sulfide.
And how did that mixture actually work?
Well, the radiation emitted by the radium would essentially excite the zinc sulfide molecules, causing the paint to emit that famous, continuous, pale green glow.
And the timing of this invention just collided perfectly with the outbreak of World War I.
Well, perfectly. Suddenly, the military desperately needed instruments, compasses, and watch dials that soldiers could actually read in the pitch black of the trenches.
Right, without striking a match and giving away their position to enemy snipers.
Exactly. So to meet this massive, super urgent military demand, USRC established a huge factory in Orange, New Jersey. And later, a similar massive operation called the Radium Dial Company opened in Ottawa, Illinois.
And they needed a very specific type of workforce to handle this, right? You can't paint microscopic numbers on a watch dial with heavy factory machinery.
No, it required extreme precision, so they hired young women, mostly in their late teens and early 20s.
Specifically chosen because their small hands provided the manual dexterity required for such tedious precision painting.
It was actually perceived as a really glamorous, highly desirable job for a young woman in the 1910s and 20s. The pay was incredibly lucrative compared to, the brutal conditions of textile mills or domestic service.
They were paid roughly a penny and a half for every single dial they successfully painted.
But a penny and a half means that to actually make a living wage, you are locked into a grueling piece rate system.
Right, you have to paint hundreds of dials a single day.
You have to work with blistering speed, and this immense economic pressure introduces the single most fatal procedure in the history of American industrial labor.
The technique the young women were strictly taught by their supervisors. It was called lip dip paint.
We have to break down the sheer mechanical horror of this technique. So the women were given these incredibly fine camel hair brushes to apply the Undark paint to the dials.
But camel hair is incredibly soft.
Exactly. After just a few strokes on the rigid, hard surface of a watch dial, the bristles would splay out. They'd lose their shape, totally ruining the sharp point needed to paint the tiny glowing numbers.
And if the women stopped to wipe the brush on a cloth or a sponge to reshape it, it wasted valuable time, right? Which cost them money.
And it also wasted the highly expensive radium paint itself, which cost the corporation money. So the factory supervisors instructed them to use their own lips or their tongues to bring the bristles back to a fine, sharp point.
That is just, it's sickening to even picture.
Place the radioactive brush between your lips to point it. Dip it into the glowing radium paint. Paint the dial. The brush loses its shape. Place the radioactive brush back between your lips to point it again.
Over and over and over. Hundreds of times every single shift.
The historical pathology records estimate that with every single dial they painted, the women ingested between 0.1 and 1 microgram of pure radium directly into their mouths.
Directly into their digestive systems.
And returning to that Trojan horse analogy, every single microgram of that ingested radium was being eagerly absorbed by their bodies and shuttled straight into their rapidly developing young skeletal systems.
The atmosphere inside these factory floors is honestly almost impossible to fully conceptualize today. The rooms were completely saturated with radium dust.
It hung in the air like a fog.
It settled on the tables, on their clothes. The women became famously known in their local communities as the Ghost Girls.
Or Ghost Girl.
Yeah. When they walked home at night through the streets of Orange, New Jersey, their hair, their dresses, and even their skin would physically glow in the dark from the accumulated radioactive dust.
And the tragic irony is that it was seen as a novelty, a magical perk of the job.
They completely leaned into it. The source materials contain all these accounts of the women jokingly painting their fingernails with the glowing paint before going out to a dance.
Wow.
They would even paint their teeth, so they would have this radiant, glowing smile in the dark. They had absolutely no idea they were playing with an invisible fire.
And this is where the narrative really requires us to radically slow down, because we need to examine the terrifying disparity of information here.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
The women on the factory floor were explicitly told the paint was completely harmless. In fact, management told them the radium would give them rosy cheeks and actually improve their vitality.
But what was happening behind the closed doors of the USRC laboratories? Like, how were the scientists and the corporate executives handling the exact same radium?
That is the most damning, chilling detail in all of the historical records. Management and the scientists who actually mixed the raw paint completely avoided direct exposure.
They knew it was dangerous.
Oh, they absolutely knew. In their laboratories, they hid behind heavy lead screens. They wore protective masks. They handled the raw radium materials exclusively with long metal tongs.
So we have a documented real-world scenario where the executives and the chemists are shielding themselves with lead and tongs, fully aware of the destructive, penetrating power of the element, while simultaneously instructing teenage girls on the factory floor to put that exact same element directly into their mouths.
It is premeditated industrial-scale
It
negligence.
really is. The silent destruction taking place inside the bodies of these young women was insidious because it didn't just happen overnight. Let's look deeply into the actual pathophysiology of what was happening within their bones.
The physics here are crucial to understand. The primary emission from the radium deposits locked inside their bones were alpha rays.
Now, for those who aren't nuclear physicists, what exactly is an alpha particle?
It is essentially a helium nucleus, 2 protons and 2 neutrons. On a subatomic scale, an alpha particle is massive. It's heavy, it's slow, and it carries an immense electrical charge.
Meaning it doesn't travel very far through the body, right?
Yeah.
But where it hits, it causes catastrophic damage.
Exactly. When an alpha particle is emitted from the radium embedded in the bone, it acts like a microscopic cannonball. It doesn't pass harmlessly through tissue like an X-ray might.
It deposits all its energy locally.
Yes, it slams right into the immediate surrounding cells, depositing all of its destructive ionizing energy into the bone marrow and the delicate blood vessels that feed the bone. It literally shreds the cellular DNA and destroys the tissue from the inside out.
But initially, this cellular trauma actually created a cruel, false sense of security, didn't it?
It did, because in the very short term, this intense, localized alpha radiation actually stimulated the bone marrow. The body's initial panic response, the radiation damage, was to overproduce red blood cells.
Ah, so that's why they felt good at first.
Exactly. For the first few years of their employment, the dial painters often felt unusually energetic. They had a literal flush to their skin. They genuinely felt healthy.
The promised rosy cheeks.
But it was a complete biological illusion. The marrow was being whipped into a frenzy by the continuous radiation, and because of radium's 1,602-year half-life, the alpha bombardment never, ever stopped.
And the timeline eventually catches up. The medical records show that 2 to 5 years after their initial exposure, the catastrophic systemic collapse begins.
The bone marrow, just totally exhausted and heavily radiated, begins to die. The tissue surrounding the bone begins to necrose.
And where do these horrific symptoms first manifest for the women? Like, where do they notice it first?
It almost always started in the mouth, which makes perfect, grim sense given the lip dip paint technique. The women would begin to experience severe, deep aching pain in their teeth.
And the teeth would rapidly become incredibly loose. Right?
Yes. Naturally, seeking relief, they would go to a local dentist to have the aching teeth pulled.
But a normal dental extraction relies on the surrounding bone and vascular tissue to form a clot, heal, and close the wound. What happens when the jawbone surrounding the tooth is already dead?
The sockets flatly refused to heal. They just remained open. Those empty sockets quickly turned into agonizing, pus-filled, bleeding ulcers in the mouth.
Because there's no blood supply to fight the infection.
Right. The infection would spread unchecked. And because the jawbone itself was completely honeycombed with radiation damage, the bone literally began to rot and break away. Pieces of the jaw would just splinter through the gums.
Oh my God. This specific, horrific pathology became formally known in the medical literature as radium jaw, or radium-induced osteonecrosis.
And alongside the decaying jaws, the systemic destruction of the bone marrow led to severe, pernicious anemia. The women suffered from extreme bone fragility.
Their bones would just snap.
Their internal structures were so weakened that their legs or arms would spontaneously fracture just from walking across a room. And ultimately, the radiation triggered the development of massive, fatal bone sarcomas.
We really have to focus on the tragedy of one woman in particular here, Amelia Maggia. Her specific story is one of the most heartbreaking in this entire archive, and her suffering actually serves as the vital catalyst for the legal battles that followed.
Amelia, who was known to her friends as Molly Maggia, was one of the early dial painters in New Jersey. In 1922, her symptoms began exactly as we just described.
An aching tooth, an extraction, a non-healing ulcer.
But her disease progressed with terrifying speed. The necrosis spread rapidly from her jaw up into the roof of her mouth and deep into the bones of her inner ear. Her jaw decayed so completely it literally had to be physically removed.
I mean, try to imagine the sheer agony of that reality. A young woman in her early 20s, her face essentially disintegrating while she is fully conscious.
On September 12, 1922, at the age of just 25, Molly Maggia died of a massive hemorrhage. The necrotic disease had finally eroded into a major blood vessel.
And we really must examine what the medical establishment officially listed as the cause of death on her death certificate.
We do, because they didn't list radium poisoning.
No, they listed syphilis.
I want us to aggressively interrogate this specific detail, because this is the exact moment the narrative shifts from a tragedy of, say, scientific ignorance to an active, malicious corporate conspiracy.
Okay, let me play the skeptic for a moment then. Is it entirely out of the realm of possibility that the local doctors in 1922 were genuinely baffled? I mean, this was a completely unprecedented occupational hazard. Radiation poisoning was barely understood by the world's top physicists, let alone a neighborhood dentist.
That's a fair point to raise.
Like, perhaps they saw severe oral ulcers and bone decay and genuinely misdiagnosed it as advanced syphilis? Or perhaps even phosphorus poisoning, which was a known hazard from the matchstick industry.
That is a completely rational defense of the local, everyday medical practitioners. But the historical documents completely dismantle that defense when applied to the corporation itself.
Because the corporation knew.
Exactly. Yes, the average dentist was baffled. But the executives and scientists at United States Radium Corporation were absolutely not baffled. They knew precisely what was happening to these women. And they consciously weaponized the syphilis diagnosis.
They utilized the misdiagnosis as a shield.
They did far more than shield themselves. Syphilis, then, as now, was a highly stigmatized, sexually transmitted infection. By ensuring that the official cause of death was listed as syphilis, the USRC achieved two extremely sinister goals.
What were they?
First, they completely absolved the corporation of any occupational liability. The narrative became that the factory didn't kill her. Her own private, immoral behavior killed her.
Wow. Shifting the blame entirely onto the victim.
And second, it served as a brutal, highly effective form of character assassination. It slut-shamed these young, mostly immigrant women, deeply embarrassing their families and silencing them through pure social stigma.
So no one would talk about it out of shame.
Right. If a woman complained of jaw pain on the factory floor, the company doctors would whisper that it was a venereal disease. It kept the entire workforce terrified, isolated, and quiet.
The calculated cruelty is just staggering.
Oh.
But as more and more women fell ill with the exact same horrific symptoms, I mean, there were dozens of them by 1924, the syphilis lie became mathematically impossible to maintain.
You can't have an entire factory floor all developing advanced syphilis at the exact same time.
Right. Public pressure was mounting within the local community. Rumors were spreading like wildfire. The dial painters were actively threatening to quit en masse.
So the USRC had to execute a maneuver. They had to appear to the public to be taking the issue incredibly seriously while secretly controlling the narrative behind the scenes.
Enter Arthur Roeder, the president of the United States Radium Corporation. In 1924, Roeder attempts to get ahead of the growing scandal by commissioning an independent, supposedly objective investigation into the health of his workers.
And he aims for the absolute highest tier of credibility here.
He does. He hires two highly respected industrial hygiene experts from Harvard University, Dr. Cecil Drinker and Dr. Catherine Drinker.
It was a highly calculated risk by Roeder. He basically assumed that the sheer prestige of Harvard would calm the anxious workers, and perhaps his corporate hubris led him to believe he could financially influence the findings.
But what did the Drinkers actually discover when they stepped onto the factory floor in Orange, New Jersey?
They were completely horrified by what they witnessed. Dr. Cecil Drinker documented a factory utterly saturated in radioactive contamination.
That was everywhere.
He noted that there were absolutely no safety precautions taken for the dial painters whatsoever. No ventilation systems, no protective gear, no warnings. He confirmed the deadly lip-pointing technique was still standard, enforced practice.
And he brought some specialized equipment, right?
He did. In his meticulous notes, he observed that when they used a dark room, every single surface glowed with radium dust. He wrote that every inch of the painters themselves glowed, specifically noting even the corsets.
The Drinkers rigorously examined the workers and their medical records, and their scientific conclusion was absolute and undeniable.
The Drinker report explicitly found that virtually every single worker in the dial painting room was suffering from catastrophic blood or bone conditions directly caused by continuous exposure to radium.
They explicitly linked the jaw necrosis and the severe anemia directly to the ingested Undark paint.
Yes. They issued a blistering report to Arthur Roeder, emphatically demanding that strict safety precautions be implemented immediately to save the remaining workforce.
And how did President Arthur Roeder respond to being handed irrefutable, Harvard-backed proof that his factory was actively killing his employees.
He rejected the scientific findings entirely.
Just ignored them.
Worse, he blatantly lied to Dr. Drinker, claiming that the illnesses must be caused by an outside contagious infection. He referenced secret internal company reports that supposedly refuted Drinker's rigorous data.
Reports he conveniently refused to ever let Drinker actually see, of course.
Naturally. And then Roeder escalated the cover-up. He didn't just suppress the Drinker report, he actively committed fraud.
Because the New Jersey Department of Labor had been asking pointed questions,
Yeah.
requesting data on the safety of the USRC factory.
Right. So Arthur Roeder took Dr. Cecil Drinker's report, fundamentally altered the findings to completely remove any mention whatsoever of radium poisoning, and submitted this forged version to the government.
That is unbelievable.
The forged document claimed, using Drinker's name and his Harvard credentials, that every girl is in perfect condition.
Forging a Harvard professor's research to appease a state labor board is just an astonishing act of corporate arrogance. But Roeder made a critical miscalculation.
He really did. He severely underestimated the communication network of the scientific community.
He absolutely did, because a colleague of the Drinkers at Harvard, a pioneering toxicologist named Alice Hamilton, was working closely with an advocacy group called the National Consumers League.
And the League had been desperately trying to help the dial painters.
Exactly. Through her government contacts, Alice Hamilton actually managed to get her hands on the report that the New Jersey Department of Labor had received.
And given her expertise, she instantly recognizes the data has been manipulated.
Yes. She writes an urgent letter to Catherine Drinker in 1925. She says, "The Department of Labor has a copy of your report, and it shows that every girl is in perfect condition. Do you suppose Roeder could do such a thing as to issue a forged report in your name?"
When Cecil Drinker discovers his scientific integrity has been hijacked to cover up a mass industrial poisoning, he is furious. I mean, rightfully so.
He informs Roeder that he is going to publish the original, unaltered data in an academic medical journal for the entire world to see.
And Roeder responds by unleashing his legal team, threatening to sue Drinker and Harvard University for defamation and breach of contract.
And initially, the sheer weight of the legal threat actually works. Drinker hesitates.
But Alice Hamilton and the National Consumers League aggressively push back, confronting the Drinkers with the undeniable evidence of Roeder's bad faith and the dying women.
So in August of 1925, completely defying Roeder's lawsuit threats, the Drinkers published their unaltered, devastating report.
We really need to kind of signpost exactly where we are in this tragedy right now. We have transitioned from this miracle element to a biological Trojan horse to a brutal corporate cover-up, and now the scientific community is finally striking back. The invisible poison is being dragged into the light.
But, publishing an academic report on factory conditions is one thing. To actually win in a court of law, to force a massive corporation to pay actual damages to the victims, the women needed forensic proof.
They needed undeniable evidence.
They needed to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the radium was physically inside their bones and that it was the specific sole cause of their suffering and death. And that brings us to what we can only call the forensic time machine.
This is where Dr. Harrison Stanford Martland enters the narrative. He was the chief medical examiner for Essex County, New Jersey. And he is truly one of the great unsung heroes of forensic pathology.
In 1925, Martland decides he's going to crack this medical mystery once and for all. But he faces a massive, seemingly impossible challenge. Like, how do you definitively prove that a microscopic amount of an invisible element is destroying a skeleton from the inside out?
Well, you have to chemically isolate it. You have to physically measure it. And Martland gets his grim opportunity when he performs autopsies on deceased dial painters, including a woman named Sarah Carlaw Millifer.
Martland realizes that traditional soft tissue analysis just isn't going to reveal the truth here, so he goes straight to the bone.
And he develops a brutal but highly effective chemical process.
He takes the skeletal remains of the victims and cremated the bones into ash. Then he boils that resulting bone ash in concentrated hydrochloric acid.
Let us really think deeply about the chemistry of that gruesome process for a second. The hydrochloric acid violently dissolves the calcium-based bone mineral, right? It strips away the biological architecture entirely.
But it leaves the radium behind.
Yes, it leaves the heavier, deeply embedded radium behind in a soluble, measurable state.
Using this grueling method, he successfully isolates the radium. But he doesn't stop with the dead. He knows he has to prove the living girls are being poisoned too, before they perish.
Which is much harder.
Right. But he understands that as radium decays inside the body, one of its natural byproducts is radon gas.
Radon-222, to be precise. It is a highly radioactive noble gas.
So Martland brings the living dial painters into his laboratory. He has them blow into specialized, highly sensitive electrometers, and he measures the radioactive radon gas present in their exhalations.
He mathematically proves that the gas is being continuously produced by the radium locked deep within their skeletons.
Every single breath they took was radioactive.
It is just an incredible piece of deductive science, but perhaps the most visceral, dramatic piece of forensic evidence in this entire saga comes 2 years later, in 1927, and it involves Molly Maggio.
Molly Maggio, the young woman who died in 1922, whose jaw was removed, whose tragic death was maliciously blamed on syphilis.
5 years after she was buried, Martland and a renowned toxicologist named Alexander Gettler secure the legal right to order her body exhumed.
And this is where the physics of radiation and the biology of the bone create a truly haunting, unforgettable image.
Gettler takes Molly Maggio's exhumed bones, he meticulously cleans them, and then he takes them into a pitch-black dark room.
He doesn't use a camera, right?
No, he doesn't. He places the bones directly onto unexposed sheets of X-ray photographic paper, covers them, and just leaves them sitting there in the dark for several days.
Because he is relying on the very nature of radiation itself, photographic film is normally exposed by light photons. But highly energetic radiation, like gamma rays and beta particles, carry enough energy to trigger that exact same chemical reaction on the film.
So when Gettler develops those sheets of X-ray paper a few days later, the images are crystal clear. You can see the exact glowing white outlines of Molly Maggio's bones permanently burned into the film.
Even 5 years after she had been buried in the ground.
Her bones were still emitting so much massive radiation that they acted like their own internal light source. They essentially took a photograph of themselves.
The analogy is just profound. The women's bones literally became their own photographic flash, documenting their own murder from beyond the grave.
It's incredibly poetic in a dark way.
The corporation had tried to bury the evidence under 6 feet of dirt and a forged death certificate. But the evidence was radioactive. It simply could not be silenced.
And the science of radiation detection was advancing rapidly, specifically because of this tragedy. Following Martland's pioneering work, a physicist at MIT named Dr. Robley Evans took on the monumental task of precisely measuring the internal radiation of the surviving girls.
He developed something called the meter arc technique.
Imagine you are one of these surviving women. You are brought into a laboratory. How does Dr. Evans measure the invisible fire inside you?
Well, imagine you're lying on a specially designed curved bed. You're positioned exactly 1 meter away in a perfect arc from a highly sensitive Geiger-Miller detector.
By standardizing the geometry of the measurement, Evans could mathematically correct for the absorption of the radiation by the patient's own body mass.
And calculate the exact quantity of gamma rays escaping their skeleton.
This is a massive leap forward in the field of health physics.
It was totally revolutionary. Dr. Evans used this exact grueling data gathered from the dying dial painters to establish the very first human tolerance limit for internal radiation exposure.
Which he ultimately set at 0.1 microcuries.
So, armed with the Drinker report exposing the horrific factory conditions, and Martland and Gettler's undeniable forensic proof of the radium physically trapped in their bones, the women finally have the scientific ammunition they needed to fight back in court.
But having the scientific evidence and finding actual legal justice are two very, very different things.
Yeah, very sure.
The legal crusade of the Radium Girls is an agonizing, just infuriating story of endurance against immense corporate power. It was spearheaded by a dial painter named Grace Fryer.
The courage of Grace Fryer cannot be overstated here.
Grace had worked at the Orange, New Jersey plant from 1917 to 1920, and by the mid-1920s, her spine was rapidly deteriorating. She had to wear a heavy, agonizing steel back brace just to sit upright.
Her jaw was decaying, honeycombed with microscopic holes.
She knew she was dying, but she refused to quietly fade away into history. She made the monumental decision to sue the United States Radium Corporation.
Which was an incredibly brave but almost impossibly difficult undertaking in the 1920s. Suing a major industrial employer for an unproven occupational disease was virtually unheard of.
The legal frameworks to protect workers simply did not exist back
It
then.
was a complete legal wasteland. It took Grace Fryer 2 full years of constant rejection just to find a single lawyer who was willing to take the case against such a powerful, wealthy corporation.
Finally, in 1927, she found a young, crusading attorney named Raymond Barry.
And Barry realized the power of a united front. She wasn't alone in this fight.
No. Barry filed a joint lawsuit on behalf of 5 women. They became known in the national press as the Radium Girls.
There was Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albino Larice.
Quinta and Albino were sisters, right?
They were, and even more tragically, they were the sisters of Amelia Molly Maggia, the woman whose glowing bones had exposed the film.
The Maggia family was utterly decimated by this single factory.
The media dubbed it the case of the 5 women doomed to die. The public outrage was absolutely palpable. But how did the USRC respond in court? Did they capitulate in the face of Martland's irrefutable forensic evidence?
Not a chance. The USRC's legal strategy was pure, ruthless attrition. They knew exactly what the medical report said. They knew these women had only months to live.
So they decided to simply run out the clock until the plaintiffs were dead.
They weaponized the legal system's inherent delays.
Endless, agonizing delay tactics. First, they argued that the claims were barred by a 2-year statute of limitations. They coldly claimed that because the women had ingested the paint in 1918 or 1919, they had missed their legal window to sue.
Conveniently ignoring the biological fact that the symptoms took years to manifest.
And that the company had actively, intentionally, lied to them about the cause of their illnesses the entire time.
The judge eventually granted a waiver for the statute of limitations, recognizing the unprecedented nature of the poisoning, but the delays just continued relentlessly.
By the time of their first actual court appearance in January of 1928, the physical condition of the 5 Radium Girls was devastating. They were unable to walk unassisted. 2 of them were completely bedridden.
When they were asked by the court to swear to tell the truth, they were physically too weak to even raise their right arms to take the oath.
It is a grotesque spectacle. These women are visibly, physically disintegrating in the courtroom, and the corporation's highly paid lawyers are just casually filing motions for continuances.
The most infuriating, morally bankrupt delay came in April of 1928. The women were deteriorating rapidly, and the judge ordered the hearings to be suspended and pushed all the way back to September.
And why? As a direct accommodation to several expert witnesses for the corporation who were, quote, summering in Europe.
They successfully delayed a trial for dying women so their wealthy executives could take a European vacation.
Exactly. But this specific, callous ruling was the breaking point for public opinion. A highly influential journalist named Walter Lippmann, writing for the New York World, unleashed a scathing, relentless editorial crusade against the judge and the USRC.
Lippmann understood the power of public shame. What did he say to mobilize the nation?
He called the delay a damnable travesty of justice. He wrote, "There is no possible excuse for such a delay. The women are dying. If ever a case called for prompt adjudication, it is the case of 5 crippled women who are fighting for a few miserable dollars to ease their last days on earth. This is a heartless proceeding. It is unmanly, unjust, and cruel."
The power of the press in this era was absolute. Lippmann's editorials created an absolute firestorm of national outrage. The courts and the company could no longer hide behind procedural delays and legal technicalities.
The immense public pressure worked. The court date was forced to be moved up to June, but the women were failing fast.
Fearing that they would all die before a jury could ever reach a verdict, Raymond Barry and the Radium Girls agonizingly agreed to an out-of-court settlement in June of 1928.
What were the specific terms of the settlement?
Each of the 5 women received a lump sum of $10,000. They were guaranteed a $600 per year annuity for the rest of their lives. And the USRC agreed to pay all of their past and future medical and legal bills.
But did the United States Radium Corporation ever officially admit that they poisoned them?
No. The settlement strictly stipulated that the USRC admitted 0 legal fault or liability.
And the darkest, most heartbreaking irony of the annuity: none of the 5 women lived long enough to collect more than 1 or 2 of those yearly checks. They all perished shortly after the settlement. Grace Fryer died in 1933.
It is a profoundly bittersweet victory. They won financial relief for their final days, but the corporation walked away without admitting guilt. But the legal shockwaves of their suffering did not stop in New Jersey.
No, they didn't. The New Jersey case lit a fuse that would eventually burn down the entire legal defense of negligent corporations. The story moved to the Midwest in the 1930s. Remember the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois?
Yes, the other major factor.
The exact same tragedy was unfolding there.
And you would rationally think, after the massive, highly publicized national scandal of the New Jersey Radium Girls in 1928, the Illinois factory would have immediately ceased the lip-pointing technique and desperately protected their workers.
The outrage is that they didn't. They continued operations with incredibly lax safeguards for years. They knew exactly what had happened in New Jersey, and they kept letting the women in Illinois lick the brushes.
But the workers in Illinois were paying attention.
A dial painter named Catherine Wolfe Donahue, who was suffering from a massive tumor on her hip and severe radium jaw, organized her coworkers and aggressively sued the Radium Dial Company.
And the legal landscape in Illinois was fundamentally shifting because of what happened in New Jersey, wasn't it?
It was, and this is where we see the direct, monumental legislative impact of the Radium Girls' suffering. In 1936, the state of Illinois passed the Occupational Diseases Act.
This was a direct result of the relentless public pressure generated by the dial painters.
The law explicitly required employers to compensate workers for cases of industrial poisoning. It changed the game from trying to prove vague corporate negligence to a strict mandate. If the workplace poisoned you, the company pays.
It fundamentally shifted the burden of responsibility away from the dying worker and onto the corporation.
Armed with this powerful new law, Catherine Donahue and her lawyer fought a grueling, desperate battle. Donahue was literally on her deathbed, weighing barely 70 pounds, giving testimony from a stretcher. She died shortly after testifying.
But in 1938, the Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in her favor.
They found the Radium Dial Company guilty and ordered them to pay compensation. The arrogant company appealed it all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but in October of 1939, the Supreme Court upheld the ruling.
The Radium Girls had finally, unequivocally won. The highest court in the land recognized their truth.
They won. But the human cost was unfathomable. So let us step back and look at the grand synthesis of this massive, exhausting history. We must connect these harrowing dots. What did the glowing bones of these young women actually buy us?
The legacy of the Radium Girls touches almost every single aspect of modern industrial life and scientific safety.
The Radium Girls' agonizing suffering directly led to the establishment of the legal precedent that a corporation can and will be held financially liable for the health of its employees.
Their relentless fight paved the way for modern workers' compensation laws across the entire country.
The massive public outrage they generated eventually contributed directly to the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA.
The idea that you have a fundamental right to a safe workplace, the idea that your employer cannot knowingly expose you to toxic substances without facing severe legal and financial consequence, that entirely modern concept was paid for in blood and rotting bone by the dial painters of New Jersey and Illinois.
And their legacy extends far beyond labor law. It goes directly into the heart of the atomic age.
Yes. When the United States government initiated the massive, highly secretive Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb during World War II, they were suddenly faced with the unprecedented prospect of thousands of workers handling highly radioactive materials like uranium and plutonium.
How did the government know how to protect them?
They turned directly to the research of Dr. Robley Evans and Dr. Harrison Martland. The safety protocols, the tolerance limits, the exact measurements of how internal radiation destroys human tissue, all of that vital data came directly from the autopsies and the physical examinations of the Radium Girls.
The scientists of the Manhattan Project knew exactly what radiation could do because they had seen the honeycomb jaws and the exposed X-ray film of Molly Maggia and Grace Fryer.
The protection of the modern worker, the safety of the entire nuclear age, was bought with the glowing bones of young women in the 1920s.
Their story proves that scientific truth, no matter how deeply buried by corporate greed, no matter how many forged reports are submitted or how many high-priced lawyers are deployed, has a half-life that outlasts the liars.
The truth, exactly like radium, continues to emit its light long after the cover-up is buried in the ground.
It is a harrowing, monumental legacy. They refused to die quietly in the dark. They forced the world to see the light.
I absolutely did.
Which brings us to the final, most vital question we must ask ourselves today. We look back at the 1920s with horror. We cannot believe that people blindly ingested glowing radioactive water or licked paintbrushes soaked in poison just because a corporation told them it was safe and a poster promised them beauty.
We view them as naive victims of a bygone era,
But human nature hasn't changed. Only the technology has changed. So I ask you, what modern miracles are we blindly inviting into our bodies, our homes, and our workplaces today? What unregulated chemicals, what unchecked industrial processes are we eagerly consuming because the marketing tells us they are safe, because they are convenient, because they promise us vitality?
What are we currently lip-pointing day in and day out without realizing the invisible dangers?
And how long will it take, how much damage will be done before the next generation's forensic scientists have to exhume our mistakes to uncover the truth? Thank you for giving us your time today. If you found this discussion valuable, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Check the description below for reference links and more information. Until next time, keep elevating your mind.
ALEATORY podcast.